Most people blame screens, allergies, or aging for tired, irritated eyes, but there's a quieter factor almost nobody checks. Right now, something is happening on the surface of your eyes that has little to do with how much you slept or how long you stared at a phone. It has to do with a thin, invisible layer of moisture that either holds together through the day or slowly breaks apart. Most never think about it. They notice the result, the dryness, the grittiness, the blur that comes and goes, and they reach for a bottle of drops, assuming that's the whole story. I want you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't about fear, and it isn't about a miracle fix. It's about a piece of the picture that gets skipped almost every time. So here's the question I want you sitting with for the next few minutes. If drops only calm the surface, what's actually shaping what happens underneath it, day after day? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what that means for your eyes, and where something as ordinary as a seed sitting in your kitchen might quietly fit into the picture. If your eyes feel fine in the morning but worse by evening, there may be a reason drops alone don't fully explain. You've probably noticed a pattern like this before, even if you never put words to it. Your eyes feel clear when you wake up, then somewhere around midday they start to sting or feel dry or blur just slightly when you try to focus on something far away. You blink a few times. It passes for a while. Then, an hour or two later, it quietly comes back. Most people assume this is simply screen fatigue or allergies or just getting older. And sometimes it is exactly that. Your eyes really do get tired from long hours of focused screen use, and allergens really can irritate the surface of the eye. But here's the part that gets missed. These explanations describe triggers, not causes. They tell you what set the discomfort off, not what made your eyes vulnerable to it in the first place. This is where most people stop looking. They treat the trigger, they use drops when the discomfort shows up, and the relief feels immediate, so the story seems finished. The eyes were dry, the drops added moisture, the problem was solved. It's a reasonable, understandable conclusion to reach. It's also, in most cases, incomplete. Drops work on the surface. They add lubrication where it's currently missing. But they don't necessarily change why the surface keeps losing that lubrication in the first place. Think of it like refilling a glass with a small crack in it. The water helps for a moment, but the crack is still there, quietly doing its work in the background. There's also an emotional layer to this that rarely gets talked about. Discomfort that comes and goes is oddly easy to dismiss, precisely because it isn't constant. If your eyes hurt all the time, you'd act on it immediately. But when the irritation shows up, fades, and shows up again, it starts to feel like background noise instead of a signal worth paying attention to. You adapt. You keep a bottle of drops in your bag or on your desk, and you use them the way you'd reach for a mint, automatically, without much thought. Think back to a symptom you once ignored simply because life was busy. Most of us have one. It's not carelessness. It's how attention works. We respond to what feels urgent and mild. Recurring discomfort rarely feels urgent, even when it's telling us something real. This does not mean something is seriously wrong. For many people, this pattern is mild, manageable, and simply a normal part of how their eyes respond to daily life. But it's worth understanding, because once you see what's actually happening beneath the surface, the whole picture starts to make a lot more sense, including why some people find that drops alone never quite solve it. So let's go there next. What is actually happening on the surface of your eye when this cycle repeats itself, day after day? Your tears aren't just water, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. When you picture tears, you probably imagine a simple liquid, something thin and clear that either shows up or doesn't. But the tear film covering your eye is actually a small, layered system, built from 3 distinct components that all have to work together for your eyes to feel comfortable. There's a mucus layer closest to the eye, which helps the tear film stick evenly across the surface instead of pooling or sliding off. On top of that sits a watery layer, which does most of the work you'd expect, hydrating the eye and washing away small irritants. And covering both of those is a thin oil layer produced by tiny glands along your eyelids, whose job is almost entirely protective. It seals the moisture in and slows down how quickly it evaporates into the air. This oil layer is the part almost nobody thinks about, and it's often the one causing the most trouble. When it's functioning well, you don't notice it at all. Your eyes simply feel fine, hour after hour. But when this layer becomes thinner, or the glands producing it become slightly inflamed, tears start evaporating faster than they should. The eye can still be producing plenty of moisture and still feel dry because the moisture isn't being held in place long enough to do its job. This is where the word inflammation matters, and it's worth pausing on because it gets used constantly without much explanation. Inflammation is simply the body's natural response to irritation or minor injury. It's not automatically dangerous. It's a normal biological process, one your body uses constantly to protect and repair itself. But when inflammation lingers longer than it needs to around these small oil-producing glands, it can quietly interfere with how well they function. You might assume this means something is inflamed in a dramatic, visible way. Usually, it isn't. This kind of low-level inflammation is often subtle enough that you'd never notice it directly. You'd only notice its effect: tears that don't last as long as they should, eyes that feel fine one moment and irritated the next. This is also why eye drops sometimes feel like they wear off faster than expected. They're replacing moisture, which genuinely helps. But if the underlying oil layer isn't holding that moisture in place efficiently, the relief is temporary by nature, not because the drops failed, but because they were only ever addressing one part of a two-part system. It also helps to understand why this system tends to lose balance with age or with heavier screen use. When you focus intently on something close, like a phone, you blink less often than usual. Fewer blinks means less redistribution of that protective oil layer, which gives evaporation more of a chance to outpace it. None of this means your eyes are failing you. Your body usually whispers before it ever starts to shout. This whisper just happens to be easy to misread, since it shows up as ordinary irritation rather than anything dramatic. So the real question becomes this: what influences the health of that oil layer from the inside before a bottle of drops ever enters the picture? This is the part that surprises people, not because it's magic, but because it's so ordinary. When researchers began looking closely at what supports that delicate oil layer from the inside, one of the most consistent findings involved a category of fat your body can't produce on its own: omega-3 fatty acids. You've probably heard the term before, usually connected to fish or heart health or brain function. Fewer people connect it to the surface of the eye. Flaxseed, along with chia and a handful of other small seeds, contains a plant-based omega-3 called ALA. Your body can convert a portion of ALA into the same types of omega-3s found in fish, though that conversion process is limited and varies from person to person. This is worth being honest about up front. Flaxseed is not a direct substitute for fish oil, and it doesn't deliver omega-3s in exactly the same form or amount. What research has shown in a more modest and specific way is that adequate omega-3 intake from food sources broadly, including seeds, is associated with better tear film stability and reduced signs of the kind of low-level inflammation we just talked about. Some studies looking specifically at dry eye symptoms have found improvement in comfort and tear quality among people who increased their omega-3 intake over several weeks or months. Other studies have shown more modest effects, or effects that varied significantly between individuals. This varies by individual, and it's important to say that plainly. Diet is one input among several. It doesn't override screen habits, environmental dryness, allergies, or underlying eye conditions. What it appears to do, based on the evidence available, is quietly support the biological environment that determines how well your natural tear film holds together in the first place. You might wonder why something this simple isn't talked about more. Partly because it's slow. Dietary changes don't produce the same immediate relief a bottle of drops can offer in seconds. The effect, when it exists, tends to build gradually. Weeks of more consistent tear stability rather than an instant fix. That's a much harder story to tell in a bottle, but it's often a more accurate one about how the body actually works. There's a common assumption worth addressing directly here. A lot of people hear seeds help with eye comfort and picture something closer to a supplement claim than an actual nutrient pathway. That skepticism is fair. Nutrition science is often oversimplified in headlines, and single foods rarely deserve the dramatic credit they're given. Flaxseed isn't unique in some mystical way. It's simply one of the more concentrated, accessible plant sources of a fat your body already relies on for this exact biological process. It also matters how it's used. Ground flaxseed is generally easier for the body to access than whole seeds, since whole seeds can pass through the digestive system largely intact. Chia seeds don't require grinding in the same way. Neither needs to be a daily ritual. They're simply foods that contribute to an intake many people fall short of. So where does this leave things practically? Not as a replacement for anything you're currently using, but as a quiet, ordinary piece of the picture worth understanding on its own terms, especially compared with the more dramatic and quicker relief that drops provide. Here's where a lot of people get the wrong idea, and where doctors actually agree. Somewhere in the retelling of this kind of research, a modest supportive finding tends to get flattened into something bigger than it actually is. Seeds support tear film health quietly becomes seeds work better than drops, and that shift matters because it isn't accurate, and acting on it could leave a real problem unaddressed. Eye drops and dietary omega-3s aren't competing solutions. They're solving different parts of the same problem on completely different timelines. Drops act immediately. When your eyes feel dry right now, a lubricating drop adds moisture to the surface within seconds, easing the irritation in real time. That's not a small thing. For many people, that immediate relief is exactly what makes the rest of the day manageable. Dietary changes work on a much slower, more foundational level. They don't ease discomfort in the next 5 minutes. Instead, over weeks or months, they may help support the underlying environment, reducing low-level inflammation, potentially improving the quality of the oil layer, so that the eye's own natural tear film holds together a little better on its own. One offers a fast fix for a symptom. The other, when it works, quietly supports the system producing the symptom in the first place. You might assume that if the seeds are addressing the real cause, they should eventually make drops unnecessary. For some people, with mild symptoms, that might genuinely happen over time. For others, those with more significant dry eye or eyelid gland dysfunction, drops or other prescribed treatments remain necessary regardless of diet. This does not mean the dietary piece is wasted. It means the two approaches are doing different jobs and neither replaces a proper diagnosis. This is worth being direct about. If you're currently using prescribed drops or treatment for an eye condition, nothing in this video is suggesting you stop, adjust, or replace that with dietary changes on your own. That decision belongs with whoever is treating you, not with a video. What this understanding does offer is a fuller picture, one where diet becomes a reasonable, low-risk addition, not a substitute for care that's already working. There's also a subtler misunderstanding worth clearing up. Some people assume that because drops are fast-acting, they must be treating the actual problem, while diet is treating something secondary. It can just as easily be the other way around. Drops manage the symptom you feel. Diet, when it has an effect, works on the conditions that produce that symptom in the first place. Neither label, primary or secondary, quite captures how the two actually relate to each other. It's also worth acknowledging why this particular myth spreads so easily. A claim like, "This simple food works better than medical treatment," is compelling precisely because it sounds like a shortcut, something ordinary discovered to outperform something clinical. Those stories travel fast because they're satisfying to hear. But eye health, like most areas of the body, rarely works through a single dramatic substitution. It works through a combination of small, ongoing inputs, most of which aren't glamorous enough to build a headline around. So, who does this actually matter for? And how do you know if it's even relevant to what you're personally experiencing? This isn't about everyone, but it's probably about more people than you'd expect. If you spend long stretches of your day looking at a screen, whether for work or simply out of habit, you're more likely to notice the pattern we've been describing. The same is true if you wear contact lenses regularly, since lenses can interact with the tear film in ways that make its stability even more important. People in dry or air-conditioned environments often notice it too, along with anyone moving into the years where gland function naturally begins to shift. None of this is a diagnosis, and it isn't meant to be. It's simply a way of recognizing whether the mechanism we've walked through is likely to apply to your own daily experience. If you recognize the pattern, fine in the morning, worse by afternoon, temporarily eased by drops, this chapter has probably already made intuitive sense to you in a way it wouldn't have 20 minutes ago. At the same time, there are situations where the right next step isn't a dietary change at all, but a conversation with a professional. Persistent pain, rather than mild irritation, deserves attention. So does any noticeable change in vision, sensitivity to light that feels new, redness that doesn't resolve, or discomfort severe enough to interfere with daily tasks like reading or driving. These aren't signs to research further on your own, however tempting that might feel. They're signs to have evaluated directly and promptly, since only a qualified eye care professional can properly determine what's actually happening and rule out anything more significant going on. You might feel some hesitation about that, a sense that it's probably nothing or that it'll resolve on its own. And sometimes it does. But there's a meaningful difference between symptoms that fit a familiar, explainable pattern and symptoms that feel unfamiliar or increasingly severe. The first is worth understanding calmly, the way we've done here. The second deserves a proper evaluation, not a guess. It also helps to remember that age alone doesn't determine any of this. Someone in their 20s who spends 10 hours a day on a screen can experience the same tear film instability as someone decades older, simply through different pathways. Someone in their 60s with healthy screen habits and a varied diet might barely notice it at all. The mechanism matters more than the birthday on your ID, which is part of why this topic gets missed so often in general health conversations built around age brackets. For most people watching this as quiet recognition rather than alarm, the takeaway is genuinely simpler than it might initially seem to be. Let's bring this back to where we started. If drops only calm the surface, what's actually shaping what happens underneath it, day after day? By now, you have a real answer. Your eyes rely on a small layered tear film, protected by a thin oil layer that can quietly lose stability through screen habits, environmental exposure, and low-level inflammation you'd never notice directly. Drops address the surface, and they do it well. What supports the system underneath is a slower, quieter set of inputs. And diet, including omega-3 rich seeds like flaxseed and chia, appears to be a meaningful piece of that picture. Zoom out for just a moment, and a broader truth sits quietly underneath all of this. So much of what affects how your body feels day to day isn't dramatic. It isn't a single cause waiting to be discovered or a single fix waiting to be applied. It's a collection of small, ordinary inputs: sleep, screen habits, hydration, nutrition, quietly working together or quietly working against each other, long before any symptom becomes noticeable enough to name. I want you to leave this with a sense of clarity, not concern. Understanding this mechanism doesn't mean you need to overhaul your diet tonight or feel behind for not having known this sooner. This does not mean something is wrong with you simply because the pattern sounds familiar. It simply means you now have a more complete picture than most people carry around. One where drops, diet, and professional care each play their own distinct role, without competing with one another. If you decide to try adding more flaxseed or chia to your meals, there's no dramatic ritual required. A spoonful of ground flaxseed stirred into oatmeal or yogurt is enough to begin. Small, consistent inputs tend to matter more than occasional large ones. On this channel, we focus on awareness, not diagnosis, and not fear. I'd genuinely like to know, have you ever noticed your eyes feeling better or worse depending on what you eat? Or did this connection surprise you? Tell me in the comments, because these small patterns are often more common than people realize once they start comparing notes. If this kind of clear, grounded health explanation is useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Because there's another everyday factor tied to eye pressure and long-term risk that almost nobody talks about, and it's not vitamin A.